The room smelled like old smoke, spilled beer, and leather that had soaked up too many miles. And when the runaway teen said, "Don't drink that," his voice cracked just enough to cut through the laughter, the jukebox dying mid-note as if the place itself held its breath. And Kane Mercer, president of the Iron Serpents, froze with the glass halfway to his mouth, eyes lifting slow and sharp. The kind of eyes that had watched friends bleed out on asphalt and learned to never ignore a bad feeling. And for a split second, everyone thought the kid was dead for speaking up, because you don't interrupt a Hell's Angel affiliate in his own room unless you want trouble. But Kane felt the scar under his ribs ache like it always did when something was wrong. A memory of a roadside ambush years back when he'd trusted the wrong man. And he set the glass down without a word, watching the amber liquid settle as silence stretched tight enough to snap. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ken didn't look at the kid yet, just listen to the room, the scrape of boots, the faint hum of bikes outside cooling in the night. And then the man who poured the drink, a smooth-faced hanger-on named Lyle, laughed too fast and reached for the glass like it was a joke gone flat. And that's when Big Ron, the serpent enforcer with shoulders like a doorframe, put a hand on Lyle's wrist and squeezed until the laugh turned into a hiss. And Kane finally looked at the teen, really looked, seeing. The dirt ground into his knuckles, the hollow eyes that came from running hard and sleeping light. And something in Kane's chest shifted because he'd worn that same look at 16 after his old man drank himself into the ground and left Kane to learn loyalty from men who bled for it. Kane asked the kid his name, calm as still water, and the kid swallowed and said Eli, and said he'd been watching the bar because he was hungry and the serpents were loud but fair with leftovers. And he saw Lyle slip something into the glass when he thought no one was looking, and Kane nodded once like that settled it. Then turned to Doc Perez, the club's medic, who dipped a clean strip into the drink and watched it change color. And the room shifted from silence to something colder because poison wasn't sloppy business. It was a message, and messages meant war. Kane remembered a night ride not 2 weeks back. Empty highway stretching black and endless, the wind tearing at his cut, thinking he'd outrun the ghost that followed him since the desert shootout that took his brother. But ghosts didn't care about speed, and now one had walked right into his house with a smile and a glass. Kane told Ron to walk Lyle outside, gentle-like, and told the rest of the club to sit and breathe, because panic killed faster than bullets. And while trying to bolt, Ron didn't chase. He just stepped once, and the doorframe shook as Lyle bounced off it. And Kane heard the crack and knew Lyle wouldn't be running again soon. Kane crouched in front of Eli, lowering himself so the kid didn't have to look up, and asked why he warned him. And Eli said because bad men had taken his sister after slipping something in her drink at a roadhouse down south, and no one believed him. And Kane felt the old scar burn hotter because promises were a currency and the world was broke on them. And he told Eli he did right, and that in this house you protect family, even when you don't share blood. Outside, rain started to tap the tin roof, soft at first, then steady, like the night was trying to wash something clean. And Kane stood and told the room that someone wanted him dead and wasn't brave enough to try it straight, and that meant they'd underestimated him, which was always a mistake. And as the serpents moved on instinct, locking doors, checking windows, Kane felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made settle on his shoulders, knowing that keeping this kid safe would cost him, that the enemy wouldn't stop with a drink, and that loyalty was a road you rode no matter where it led, because turning back was worse than dying on it. And as the rain soaked the parking lot and the neon flickered, Kane Mercer made the call in his head that he'd been avoiding since the desert, that this time he wouldn't wait for the hit to land, and somewhere deep inside, under the scars and the leather and the years, A part of him hoped that saving one scared kid might balance the scales just enough to let him sleep when this was over, even though he knew better, because consequences always collected their due. By dawn, the rain had burned itself out, leaving the air sharp and clean in a way that never lasted, and the Iron Serpent's clubhouse sat low and quiet against the gray morning like an animal pretending to sleep, but inside the tension moved, boots on concrete, coffee poured too strong, the low murmur of men who trusted each other with their lives and didn't waste words. And Kane stood at the head of the long, scarred table, hands flat on the wood, feeling the weight of what came next settle into his bones, because poison meant planning, and planning meant choosing who might not come back. Big Ron leaned against the wall near the door, arms crossed, watching everything, his job to break problems when talking failed, while Maeve, the club's strategist and the only one who could read numbers and people the same way, flipped open a battered notebook and started laying out timelines without being asked. And Doc Perez cleaned his glasses slow and methodical like he always did when nerves crept in, because he'd learned long ago that calm hands saved lives. There was Jax, the lookout, young and sharp-eyed, already replaying the night in his head, and old Wes, who handled money and favors and had survived 3 presidents by knowing when to shut up. And near the back, quiet as a shadow, sat Eli, wrapped in a borrowed jacket too big for him, watching these men like they were something out of a story he didn't believe in yet. Kane spoke low but steady, telling them what the test strip showed, telling them all hadn't made it past the end of the alley before talking. Not because Ron hurt him too much, but because fear did the rest, and the name that came out of Lyle's mouth settled heavy in the room. Mateo Cruz, a cartel broker who ran routes through the county using fronts and crooked cops. A man who smiled on TV charity drives and buried people in the desert without blinking. Maeve tapped her pen once and said Cruz didn't make sloppy moves, which meant this was either a warning or a setup. And Kane nodded because he'd been thinking the same thing, remembering the last time he crossed a man who liked to send messages first, remembering how it ended with a closed casket and a folded flag. Ron asked the question everyone else was thinking, why now? Why Kane? And Wes answered before Kane could, saying Cruz had been sniffing around the Serpent's territory since the state cracked down on his usual routes. And Kane's refusal last month to let cartel freight move through their land had probably been taken as an insult, and insults got answered. Kane looked at Eli then, really looked, and saw the target shift, because Cruz didn't just want Kane gone, he wanted leverage, and kids made people reckless. Kane told Jax to double perimeter watches and run plates on every unfamiliar vehicle within 5 miles. Told Maeve to pull favors and find out which cops Cruz owned. Told Ron to keep Lyle alive and breathing until they squeezed everything out of him. And told Doc to keep Eli close and fed and watched, because a hungry kid made bad decisions, and the club moved without argument. The kind of smooth coordination that only came from shared history and unspoken trust. As they worked, Kane drifted into a quiet flashback he didn't invite, the hum of a night ride years ago with his brother riding just ahead, taillight bobbing like a heartbeat, the radio crackle that came too late, the explosion of sound and light, and Kane waking up in a ditch with blood in his mouth and a promise broken forever. And he shook it off because memories didn't help you win. Midday brought confirmation when Maeve came back pale but focused, saying 2 county deputies were on Cruz's payroll, and one sat less than a mile from the clubhouse, which meant eyes were already on them. And Kane felt the net tightening, the old familiar pressure that came before violence. And he told the club they wouldn't run, because running taught men like Cruz that fear worked. Instead, they planned, quietly and thorough, mapping routes and choke points, deciding who would talk and who would watch. And through it all, Eli listened, absorbing words like angles and timing and exit, learning fast because kids who ran learned fast or didn't last. At one point, Eli asked Cain why he didn't just hand him over and make it stop, and the room went still again, not from anger, but from the weight of the question, and Cain answered without heat, saying, because once you trade a kid for peace, you never have peace again. You just teach monsters what price you'll pay. And Eli nodded like that made terrible sense. As evening crept in, engines rumbled to life in ones and twos. Night rides heading out on recon under a sky bruised purple and gold, and Cain rode last, the road stretching empty and endless, wind pulling at his jacket, thinking about how leadership was mostly about choosing which pain you could live with, and knowing crews wouldn't wait long, because men like that hated being denied. When they regrouped after dark, Jax reported a black SUV, circling twice then disappearing. Doc said Eli hadn't slept, but at least he'd eaten, and Ron Sedlaw was talking himself hoarse, confirming crews wanted Cain dead slow in public, and Cain felt the inevitability settle in, the sense that the next move wouldn't be theirs to make. He gathered them one last time that night, voice low, eyes steady, telling them this wasn't just about him or territory anymore. It was about what kind of men they were when tested, and one by one, they met his gaze. No speeches, no chest thumping, just the quiet acceptance of brothers who knew the road ahead was dark and rode it anyway. And somewhere outside, unseen, the enemy drew closer, patient and cruel. And Cain knew the collision was coming whether he wanted it or not. The first move came just after midnight, quiet enough to almost pass for coincidence, when the power cut out across the block, and the clubhouse dropped into a heavy darkness broken only by the red glow of exit signs and the distant rumble of engines on the highway. And Cain knew instantly this wasn't random because Cruz never announced himself with noise. He preferred absence, the sudden removal of things people relied on. Cain lifted his hand, and the room stilled, years of drilled instinct snapping into place. And somewhere in the dark, Jax whispered that he'd lost camera feeds at the same time as the lights, which meant planning, which meant the enemy was close. Cain felt the old familiar calm slide over him, the one that always came before blood, and he told Ron and made to split coverage while Doc took Eli into the back room and locked it down, because no matter what happened out front, the kid was the line that couldn't break. The first shot came through a side window, not wild, not loud, just precise enough to shatter glass and punch into the wall where Cain's head had been seconds earlier, and that confirmed it wasn't a scare tactic anymore. It was execution. Cain moved low and fast, boots finding cover by memory as Ron returned fire controlled and clean, not trying to win, but trying to buy time. And Cain thought about how crews like to test defenses, sending professionals to probe before committing real force. And that meant this was only the opening act. Outside, engines revved then faded, a tease, and Cain realized crews wanted him alive long enough to suffer, which meant the real play would be leverage. And his mind snapped to Eli in the back room, just as Maeve shouted that the rear door alarm had tripped. Cain ran, heart pounding but head clear, and burst into the hallway to see Doc slumped against the wall, conscious but bleeding from the shoulder, and the back room door hanging open, Eli gone. And for a moment the world narrowed to a single cold point in Cain's chest because this was the exact shape of his worst memories repeating themselves. Doc choked out that two men in county deputy jackets had flashed badges and walked in like they owned the place. And Cain didn't waste breath on curses because rage was fuel and he needed it later, not now. He gathered the club fast, voices low and clipped, and Maeve's face told him what he already knew, that the corrupt deputies were Cruz's, that this was the move she'd feared, and that going after them meant stepping into a trap. Cain said they were going anyway, because some traps you walked into with eyes open, and he felt the weight of leadership heavier than ever, knowing every man who followed him tonight did so by choice. They split into two teams, Ron leading the pursuit, Cain taking the longer route to cut them off, nights swallowing the sound of bikes as they rode hard through back roads and industrial sprawl, empty highways stretching black and endless under a moon that didn't care. Cain's mind drifted in flashes between the road and memory, seeing his brother's taillight again, hearing the promise he'd made to never leave family behind, and realizing promises were only tested when they hurt. They found the deputy's cruiser abandoned near an old meatpacking plant cruise owned through shell companies. The place dark except for one flickering light, and Cain felt the certainty settle in that Eli was inside, scared and trying to be brave, and that cruise was close enough to feel confident. Inside the plant the air was cold and metallic, footsteps echoing too loud, and Cain signaled quiet as they moved, hearts pounding, weapons ready, and then a voice came over the loudspeaker, smooth and amused. Cruz himself welcoming Cain by name, congratulating him on loyalty like it was a weakness to be admired before being exploited. Cruz spoke about deals and territory and how easy it would all be if Cain would just learn to bend. And Cain listened while moving because men like Cruz talked when they thought they were winning. They found Eli tied to a chair under the light, bruised but alive, and Cain's chest loosened just enough to breathe. But then Cruz stepped out of the shadows with a gun leveled not at Cain, but at Ron, because Cruz understood leverage better than anyone. Cruz said this could end clean, that Cain could hand over his routes and his silence, and walk away with the kid and one less brother. And the choice slammed into Cain like a physical blow, because there was no option without blood. Ron met Cain's eyes and shook his head once, small and final. And Cain saw all the years there, all the fights and laughs and quiet loyalty, and he knew Ron was offering himself to keep the club whole. Cain's mind raced, searching for angles, for a third path that didn't exist, and in that split second Maeve moved, not with a weapon, but with words, calling out one of Cruz's men by name, exposing a debt Cruz hadn't paid, a family he'd abandoned, and the distraction was just enough for Jax to cut the lights. Chaos erupted, gunfire sharp and blinding in the dark, men shouting, bodies moving, and Cain lunged for Eli, cutting him free and dragging him toward cover as Ron went down hard. Not dead, but hurt bad, and Cain felt the cost land even as adrenaline kept him moving. By the time the dust settled, Cruz was gone, slipping away like smoke, leaving behind broken men and broken promises, and Cain knelt beside Ron, pressing his hands to the wound, knowing this wasn't over, knowing Cruz would be back, and feeling the bitter truth settle in that saving the kid had only bought them a bloodier future, one where every choice would hurt worse than the last. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that felt like an accusation, and the iron serpents gathered in the hospital corridor where the coffee tasted like metal and the lights hummed too loud. Ron lying behind glass with tubes in his arms and a stubborn pulse that refused to quit, and Cain stood watching him breathe, counting each rise and fall like it was a promise he couldn't afford to break, because the cost had already been paid and the bill wasn't done yet. Doc came out wiping his hands, saying Ron would live but wouldn't ride for a while, saying luck had a cruel sense of humor, and Cain nodded because gratitude and guilt were twins he'd learned to carry together. Eli sat on a plastic chair, clutching a paper cup, eyes red but steady, and when Cain met his gaze there was no blame there, just a quiet question about what came next, And Kane realized this was the part leadership never prepared you for, explaining consequences to someone who didn't ask to be in the storm. Kane told the club they were done waiting, done reacting, because crews thrived on fear and delays, and the only way to end it was to put the weight back on him, to make him feel hunted for once. Maeve laid it out soft and clear, a ledger of Cruz's sins mapped to places and times, a charity gala that night at a riverfront hall where Cruz would shake hands and smile for cameras, where his guards would be thick but his arrogance thicker, and Kane felt the old scar burn again, the familiar warning that this would change them no matter how it ended. They planned without theatrics, roles assigned, exits marked, contingencies layered, because spectacle was for movies and survival was for men who knew better. And as dusk fell they rode, engines low, night swallowing them as the river glimmered like a blade. Kane changed into a suit that felt like a costume, the cut itching against old wounds, thinking about how masks were just tools like any other, and inside the hall the music swelled and laughter bounced off glass. Cruz already working the room with easy charm, a predator dressed as a benefactor. Kane waited, watched patterns, counted guards, felt the weight of every step as he crossed the floor, and when Cruz saw him, the smile didn't falter, it sharpened, because some men enjoyed recognizing danger. They spoke quietly near the balcony overlooking the water, Cruz praising loyalty again, mocking it even, saying Kane could still choose comfort over graves. And Kane answered just as quietly that comfort was a lie sold by men who never paid their debts. Somewhere behind them, Maeve set the hook, a whisper to a donor, a document slipped to a reporter, truth traveling faster than bullets when it wanted to, and Cruz sensed it, the way his eyes flicked and his jaw tightened, the first crack in a mask. Guards moved, hands near jackets, and Kane stepped closer, lowering his voice, telling Cruz this ended tonight, one way or another, because families were not bargaining chips. Cruz laughed thin, sharp and ugly, and reached for his gun, and the room exploded in emotion as Ron's absence echoed like a wound, as Jax drew fire away with a crash of tables, as Doc dragged a bleeding guard aside to keep him alive despite everything, because lines mattered even now. Kane and Cruz burst onto the balcony, rain starting again like the night had opinions, the river roaring below, and they circled each other in close quarters where power meant less than will, Cruz firing wild as Kane closed the distance. The crack of bone against bone loud over the music, both men stumbling as the world narrowed to breath and pain. Cruz snarled about empires and inevitability, about how men like him always survived, and Kane drove him back against the railing, feeling the slick of rain and blood, thinking about the road and his brother and a kid who spoke up when it mattered, and he made the hard moral choice he'd been circling since the poison glass, choosing justice that didn't look clean but felt necessary. Kane disarmed Cruz and didn't kill him. Not then, not like that, because death would have been an escape, instead pinning him until sirens cut through the night, until cameras turned and donors gasped, and the truth Maeve released took root, corrupt deputies named, shell companies exposed, the web pulled tight around Cruz until his empire shrank to a man in cuffs screaming about deals that no longer existed. After, when the rain eased and the river kept moving like it always did, Kane stood alone on the balcony and let the shaking come, the cost tallying itself in bruises and scars and men who would heal slower than they wanted. And when he went back inside, the club was already closing ranks, bruised but unbroken. Days later, Ron woke with a grin and a warning about owing Kane a drink. Doc slept for 12 hours straight. Jax rode perimeter like nothing could touch him, and Eli packed a small bag with help from Maeve, a safe place lined up far from Cruz's reach. And when the kid hugged, Kane, it surprised them both, quick and fierce. And Kane told them to live loud and honest, to speak up again when it mattered, because that was how you push back. The iron serpents rode at dawn, night giving way to light on an empty highway. Engines steady, losses carried, lessons learned, and Kane felt the road open ahead, knowing justice had been delivered at a cost, knowing consequences never stopped coming, and choosing anyway to keep the promise that mattered most, to protect family, to ride forward, and to leave just enough space in the silence for redemption to find him when it was ready.